So good morning and welcome to this first session on the third day of our workshop. So today Professor A.K. Suresh is going to talk about recent advances in reaction engineering, catalysis and separation processes. So this is a conventional old chemical engineering research area, and we have very active research going on in this area in our department. I'll give a brief introduction to Professor Suresh. Professor Suresh did his BE in chemical engineering from Mysore University and then went to Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore for his ME in chemical engineering. Later he went to Monash University for his PhD, and after his PhD, for a brief period of time, he worked with the Unilever Research Center at Bangalore. I think since 1988, Professor Suresh is with us in chemical engineering department. So Professor Suresh has very wide research interests. He has been working on reaction engineering, biochemical engineering, multiphase systems, interfacial polycondensation and so on. He has guided 16 PhD students in this area, widely published in very reputed journals like AICHE journal, and currently 8 students are working under his guidance for PhD. He has guided large number of MTech students. Professor Suresh was our head of the department 2004 to 2007, 5 to 8 and then later he was Dean of Faculty Affairs for almost 5 years. So with this introduction I would like to hand over stage to Professor Suresh on recent advances in research in reaction engineering and catalysis.
So welcome to this last day. I hope you are not too tired. So today in the morning session we will, in the first session, we will go through some recent advances in chemical reaction engineering. And reaction engineering is a broad enough field that it includes catalysis as well. But because of the special focus we have been developing in recent years on catalysis, I have mentioned that separately. And what I am going to say is not going to be comprehensive in any sense, that it's in the sense that there will be areas in chemical reaction engineering in which research is going on in various parts of the world that I might not be able to cover. So my coverage is going to be limited to the kind of work that is going on at IIT Bombay and its extensions, right? So now chemical reaction engineering, as you might know, is a unique preserve of chemical engineers. If you look at any other topic that you would have studied in your curriculum, such as mass transfer, heat transfer, fluid mechanics, etc., they are all derived from mechanical engineering, and therefore mechanical engineers also study it, civil engineers study it, it is important for aeronautical engineers and so on and so forth. But it is the subject matter of reaction engineering that sets apart the chemical engineer from the other varieties of engineers that you come across. And therefore in some sense it defines the activity of chemical engineering, because chemical engineering is concerned with chemical plants, and any chemical plant worth the name has a reactor at its heart, right? On the other hand, the applications of chemical reaction engineering are not limited to chemical plants alone, because if you look at the kind of developments that are today taking place in materials, whether for energy harvesting in various ways, or whether for electronic devices and so on and so forth, there is a lot of chemical engineering that is involved in the synthesis and development of these kinds of materials. For example, silicon there is a lot of chemical engineering that is involved in the production of silicon. And similarly, if you look at various metallurgical operations, there is a lot of chemical engineering that goes on there as well. In the production of iron, for example, blast furnace, there is a lot of chemical engineering. Only difference is that it takes place under conditions of temperature which are very far removed from the kind of temperatures that are involved in regular chemical reactions. If you look at various activities involved in the production of energy, thermal power plants and the like, or coal gasification, pyrolysis, all of these, they all involve chemical reactions, and therefore chemical reaction engineering and understanding of the concepts of reaction engineering becomes important. Now, how is chemical reaction engineering different from the subject matter of chemical kinetics, which chemists also are interested in? For example, chemists also are interested in the rates in which reactions occur, the yields which various reactions give, what are the selectivities, and so on and so forth. So what is different about chemical reaction engineering is that here we regard chemical reactions as having a certain kind of a intrinsic characteristic, but their behavior in a given environment may or may not reveal that full potential of the reaction itself. Okay. In other words, to take an example, a human being, for example, has certain innate potential, and in a certain setting he may not be able to exercise that full potential. In some other setting he might shine much better. Okay, we have all seen examples where somebody doesn't do too well in one setting or in one environment. You take the same person and put him in another environment, and he blooms, and then he delivers much more. Okay, so chemical reactions are something like that. So they have a certain intrinsic rate, they have certain intrinsic stoichiometry. They are capable of yielding certain kinds of selectivities and so on and so forth. But when you have to conduct these reactions somewhere, right? So when you put them in a reactor, the reactor influences the environment of in which the reaction takes place, influences the behavior of the reaction in various ways. It influences the rate, it influences the selectivity, it influences the safety and operability characteristics of the reaction also. Therefore, it is this interaction of the environment with the intrinsic characteristics of the reaction that is at the heart of chemical reaction engineering. So we need to understand this, and therefore this understanding helps us in designing reactors to get the best out of a reaction. Okay, knowing the intrinsic characteristics of a reaction, which chemists will be able to tell us, and in days to come we might be able to even calculate these characteristics from first principles, from quantum mechanical kind of calculations. But knowing that, to get the best out of that kind of a reaction, what kind of reactor systems are best suited, what kind of reactor systems are safe, what kind of reactor systems are sustainable and minimize the effects of environment on the environment. So these are the issues with which chemical reaction engineering gets concerned. So with that brief introduction, let's get started on this. And what this slide, slightly busy slide, shows is that is the general canvas of chemical reaction engineering, and this is what happens anywhere when you talk about chemical reaction engineering. It is what happens in IIT Bombay also. So basically we are interested in theoretical studies on chemical reactions and how they are affected by the environment. There is modeling and simulation which build on these theoretical studies. And there is of course experimentation to validate these theories, and in some cases where theoretical analysis is not possible or too complicated, we depend on experimentation to determine the characteristics which allow us to design reactor systems and operate them. Now all these studies are basically driven by a desire to improve the rates and selectivity. So these are the two driving forces that have been there since the beginning of chemical reaction engineering. We are interested in improving the rates because higher rates will mean smaller equipment, and in batch processes, smaller extents of time, you can produce more in a given extent of time, you can sell those products and make more money and so on and so forth. So there is an economic incentive in improving the rates. Even more important is the improvement in selectivity, because chemical reactions rarely occur in isolation. Okay, they occur together. There are several reactions that occur at the same time. Not all of those reactions are of interest to you, right? So one of them, or maybe a couple of them, may produce products of interest. the others may degrade those products or produce products which are not of interest or may even be harmful, right? So the implication of all this is that once the reaction is done, you have produced a mess that needs to be cleaned up so that you can separate the desired products from the other junk, and so on and so forth. So downstream processing, or what is known as product workup, becomes quite complicated. And in order to address that issue, if you can engineer your process itself such that it is very selective, say by the use of a catalyst or by the choice of an appropriate reactor system or operating conditions, all of this matter. So the rate and selectivity have been the traditional drivers for reaction engineering research. But in recent years, operating strategies which look at issues of safety in a very quantitative and analytical kind of manner, and also issues of environmental impact and energy efficiency, all of this have become important. And these are matters of operating strategies: safe operation, environmentally benign operation, and so on and so forth. So these are the drivers these are the motivating factors which drive the research in those directions. And as I said, energy and environment and the way in which the chemical reaction or conduct of the chemical reaction influences the environment, the kind of energy impact it has in terms of its exothermicity or endothermicity or other ways in which it affects the energy consumption of the plant, and so on. So these are becoming important. And one major theme that has been surfacing in more recent times is the recognition that nature seems to conduct thousands of reactions in every single cell, which is of micronic dimensions, and it seems to do so very, very efficiently. So there is a lot that we can learn by understanding how nature does it and trying to mimic that in engineered systems, in human engineered systems. So this biomimicry is therefore becoming an important theme in recent years. So these theoretical studies, experimentation, modeling, and simulation, they are expanded somewhat in here. So when you come to reactor modeling and design, what goes into that is a knowledge of reaction kinetics. So the subject matter of reaction kinetics is somewhat of a common domain between chemistry and chemical engineering, but chemical engineering looks at it slightly differently. Chemists tend to look at it in terms of the kinds of bonds that are broken and made. For example, they classify reactions as oxidations, chlorinations, alkylations, and so on and so forth, because the kind of group interactions or electronic interactions are similar in these groups of reactions. But for chemical engineers, what is more important is how does temperature affect the reaction rate? How does the concentration of this or that substance influence the reaction rate? In other words, we are concerned with reactions being first order, second order, third order, etc., homogeneous or heterogeneous, and the activation energy of reactions, and so on and so forth. And from that point of view, a first order reaction, whether it is a chlorination or an oxidation or a reduction, means the same thing to us chemical engineers, whereas they might mean very different things to a chemist. So that is how chemical kinetics is understood and interpreted in reaction engineering work. And then this has to be combined with the usual transport processes of mass, momentum, and energy. So you have the transport processes, an understanding of these transport processes and how reaction kinetics modifies and enters into the transport equations becomes important. And then there is, added to all this, the reaction environment brings its own idiosyncrasies, its own peculiarities into the whole business, and we have to worry about non-idealities, residence time distributions, and the consequences of that on rate and selectivity, and so on and so forth. And then, so many of these things become very, very complicated, or at least the order of complexity increases substantially when you don't have a single phase in the reactor but multiple phases. Okay, and this is a very common occurrence, especially when you have catalysts, because by their very nature, catalysts are capable of being reused, and one thing that promotes the ease of reuse is being able to separate the catalyst very quickly. So if the catalyst is in a separate phase from the rest of the reaction mixture, then it becomes easy to separate and reuse it, and therefore heterophase or multiphase reactions become the order of the day. especially in catalysis, but also in various other contexts where there is sometimes you have an oxidation and you want to use the cheapest available oxidant, and what can you think of other than air? Okay, there can be nothing cheaper than air. So, but when you use air, then that's a gas phase and the reaction may be in the liquid phase. Therefore, some multiplicity of phases has to be tackled in the reactor. Now, I mentioned catalysis, and that's a major area because the moment you think of making a product from a less valuable from a cheap resource, which may be natural or which may be a waste product from another industry or which may even be a byproduct of another industry, the first question that you ask is there a good catalyst for this reaction which converts this raw material into that product, because that then means that you can conduct the reaction under fairly low temperature and pressure conditions, and therefore the energy intensive nature of the reaction is mitigated somewhat. And also, more importantly, the catalyst will selectively promote the reaction of interest. If you are lucky enough to find a good catalyst, it will selectively promote the reaction of interest and not promote the reactions which are harmful or which are undesirable, and therefore it will improve the selectivity. Therefore, from both rate and selectivity considerations, you would always look for a catalyst, and this is one wishes that there was a systematic way of working towards the best catalyst for a given reaction. Right now we are not in that position, and we have not been in that position from the times reaction engineering started getting implemented either. Therefore, it is very much of an art. It is less of an art today than it was, let's say, 100 years ago, but it is still an art. Okay, so you have to try various systems. You have to go back to the accumulated knowledge from previous reactions, and by analogy guess that maybe this group of metals will form a good catalyst for this reaction. And then by the time you translate this knowledge to practice, you have to support that metal on a suitable support. That support has its own influence on the way in which the catalyst functions, and so on and so forth. So other issues will complicate the matter a little further. So an understanding of all of this becomes important, and it's very much a area of because of its importance, intense research. So catalysis research, of course, biomimicry is one important part of catalysis, because there is a lot that we can learn from the very highly selective way in which biocatalysts or enzymes, as they're called, function in the natural environment. So biomimicry influences the science of catalysis, and then of course there's a lot to the way in which you synthesize catalysts. For example, you need to worry about the particle size of the metallic clusters, the way in which the active element is dispersed on the support, and so on and so forth. So these are all aspects of synthesis. And then there is characterization. So you synthesize a catalyst, and you need to know how well you have synthesized the catalyst. So there are various instrumental methods for characterization, and they are still developing. And then there is electrocatalysis. So there is a lot of advantage to be had in mixing electricity and chemistry. Okay, this is because after all we know that thermodynamically a reaction takes place because there is a free energy advantage for the system to conduct that reaction. The system free energy goes down when the reaction goes in a certain direction, and that is the direction in which the reaction will spontaneously go according to the second law of thermodynamics. Now this free energy change can be interpreted in terms of a electrical potential, and so you have come across half cell potentials and so on and so forth, and therefore the necessary the necessary conditions for the reactions can be generated in terms of an electric field, applying an electric field as well. We will take some examples later on, but electrochemical synthesis and electrocatalysis are therefore important. They are also important from the point of view of the interest in the energy scenario. That is very important these days. For example, fuel cells and batteries and so on and so forth, both generation of energy as well as storage of energy. So what we will do next is we will quickly go through the dominant themes which are being tackled here, and maybe also pick some examples from elsewhere, and then look at the approach to reaction engineering and catalysis research that is usually followed, and especially so in our department. So there are homogeneous systems and liquid systems, and when you consider homogeneous systems, by far the I must mention one thing, that reaction engineering, while I said that it is a unique preserve of chemical engineers and so on and so forth, is often considered as a very mature field because it's been around for hundreds of years, and the basic theory is reasonably well developed, and it only remains to apply that theory to particular cases. Okay, so this is one point of view. But as we go along, we will see that although the reaction in terms of principles, there is a certain amount of maturity in the field, there are a lot of unsolved issues when you apply it to specific cases, and therefore the issue does get quite complicated, and therefore there is a lot of research material in this field yet. Okay, for example, even if you take a simple thing like a homogeneous reaction, the situation today is that as far as gas phase reactions are concerned, the understanding is reasonably good, and you also have theoretical tools like the density functional theory and so on and so forth, which are reasonably successful in predicting the course of reactions, gas phase reactions, simple reactions which are not very complicated in terms of having a complicated mechanism and so forth. But when it comes to liquid phase reactions and solid phase reactions, there is a lot to be understood yet. Okay, how these reactions take place and what are the consequences in terms of the distribution of products in the reaction phase and so on and so forth. So when we come to homogeneous reactions, I will give you an example from polynitration, which is the work of Professor Juvekar's group, where you will see that even a reaction that is as old as nitration, okay, nitric acid is one of the first chemicals which became important even before industrial revolution and so on, and therefore one might be tempted to think that everything about nitration is known, but not so. And even polynitration, which goes into making explosives like trinitrotoluene or TNT, it has been used and applied since many decades. But even then, there are intricacies in the reaction which have avoided a clear explanation, and we will come to that in a little while. So the goal here is to, because these are systems which are prone to explosion and so on, safe and continuous synthesis of explosives such as TNT is important. I mean, you should be able to, it'll be much nicer if you can predict under what conditions the reactions are likely to run away and produce explosive kind of situations and avoid them. So here, as we will talk about in greater detail in a moment, a tendency of aromatics to stack in a certain way so that the pi electrons can move across molecules in a free and unhindered way is a theme that has become important, and that has important influences on both the solubility of the chemical that you are trying to nitrate, the aromatic that you are trying to nitrate, and also more importantly on the reaction rate itself. Okay, so we will talk about that, and that's the theme here, effect of stacking on kinetics of nitration. You can look at the stacking, or you can identify the stacking by proton NMR and techniques like that. I will talk about some of our own work on interfacial polycondensation, which is a reaction that I had occasion to mention on the other day when Professor Juvekar gave his lecture on interfaces and interfacial engineering. This is a reaction that this is a polymerization reaction. It's a condensation polymerization or a step polymerization reaction that takes place at the interface between two liquid phases. Hence, it is categorized under liquid systems. And what happens is that each of the liquid phases has one of the monomers. Therefore, the reaction does not occur in the bulk of either phase. The only place where the two monomers can come together and react is the interface, and the reaction product in turn is also insoluble in both the phases. Therefore, it forms a film at the interface, and this kind of a spontaneous formation of the film is somewhat convenient in producing products such as microcapsules of, let's say, enzymes or pesticides or herbicides. So the intention might be to contain the product encapsulated, or it may be to release the encapsulated substance to the environment in a controlled and sustained kind of manner. Okay, so for either of these situations, you might want to encapsulate and produce capsules of this, and because you can conduct this reaction at the surface of drops, you'll get the capsules directly. Okay, so that is one advantage of these reactions. The reaction is also used in producing membranes for separation applications, such as reverse osmosis membranes. The dominant type of reverse osmosis membrane chemistry is about polyamides, which form a very thin layer, and the polyamide is formed by this kind of a reaction. It forms a very thin layer, which is a few hundred angstroms thick, on top of a support membrane, and so interfacial polycondensation is the reaction at play here. So here our interest has been both in the context of microencapsulation and membrane synthesis to measure reaction kinetics, which is a problem because the reaction is extremely fast. It is finished in a matter of seconds. So how to monitor these reaction kinetics, and why is it important to measure these kinetics? If it is so fast, then why are we worried about it? It is because kinetics can influence the or can be influenced by the reaction environment, and kinetics through the reaction environment can influence the membrane structure, and once the membrane structure is influenced, it influences the functional properties such as permeation rate or mechanical strength of these membranes. So these are the issues that we are interested in. Coming to gas liquid systems, which is another kind of a multi-phase system in which a lot of work is going on here, our interest has been in liquid phase air oxidations. I gave that as an example a few minutes ago. So the air oxidations which we are currently working on are cyclohexane and glycerol, but our interest is in more generally in the mechanisms that drive these kinds of reactions, and what kind of catalysts can be found for these reactions, and how do we handle the complexity of the chemistry, and so on and so forth. So mechanisms and selectivity are issues that concern us. A related issue or related theme that we have been researching, which has ramifications not only in reaction engineering but also outside of reaction engineering in general mass transfer operations, is the transport properties of nanofluids, and I will talk a little bit more about what I mean by nanofluids and what kind of transport properties we are interested in, and so on and so forth. So we feel that there is a potential in the use of these nanofluids, which are basically suspensions of nanoscale solid materials in liquids, in conventional liquids. So these nanofluids have potential for intensifying processes which are dominated by certain kinds of transport processes, whether heat transfer or mass transfer, and I will talk about that a little bit more later on. And one particular application that we are concentrating on, which is much talked about in today's scenario, is the capture of carbon dioxide from flue gases and other streams. Coming to another kind of a heterogeneous system or multi-phase system, we have gas-solid systems, which are important in very many synthesis applications, but also particularly in automotive catalysis. Okay, there are all these restrictions today. You might have heard of Euro 1, Euro 2, Euro 3, etc. Specifications on the gases that come out of the automobile exhaust, and the combustion is often not complete, therefore there are hydrocarbons in the exhaust, and there may be carbon monoxide, there are nitrogen oxides, and so on and so forth. So these days it is compulsory for all vehicles to be equipped with a catalytic device which converts these to more benign products which can be let out into the environment. So this automotive catalysis, of course, if you look at the number of cars and trucks and buses that are there on the roads, you will realize that any metal that is used as a catalyst will be needed in huge amounts, right? So the metals that have been identified as best are unfortunately not very cheap. Okay, platinum and rhodium. Rhodium is much more expensive than even platinum. Platinum is not cheap, but rhodium is even much more expensive than platinum. So these are the kinds of materials, and whether we can understand the way in which these catalytic metals work, and therefore in the ultimate scenario replace this with cheaper materials, or in the shorter run reduce the content of rhodium and increase the content of platinum, that itself brings down the cost substantially. So what are the kinds of synergies that occur between various kinds of catalysts in an automobile catalytic converter is one theme that we have been looking at. So that in terms of the general issues that are involved, the way of analyzing these reactions at the microscopic level, in other words what is called as a microkinetic approach to understanding catalysis, is something that we are looking at here. Another issue that is relevant to gas solid systems is the occurrence of nonlinear phenomena which manifest themselves in various kinds of patterns that form in catalytic packed bed reactors. So when I say patterns, these may be patterns in temperature profiles, patterns in the reactor behavior in terms of oscillations and so on and so forth. So that's a matter of interest. We are trying to understand that because it can have very significant implications on the safe operation and on the selective operation of these kinds of reactors. So some of these themes are mentioned here. So these themes have been investigated in the context of candidate reactions such as carbon monoxide oxidation, ethylene hydrogenation, hydrodesulfurization, and so on. Coming to a third kind of or rather a fourth kind of a multi-phase reaction system in which work is going on here, we are investigating certain features of solid-solid reactions. Okay, the way in which reactions occur when at least one of the reactants is continuously distributed. Okay, such as happens when one of the reactants is a fluid phase, gas or a liquid, is easy to understand because the molecules are moving about, and in the course of that movement they will find the molecule of the other substance which may be in the same phase or in a different phase, and a reaction will occur. How do reactions occur when both reactants are solids? There are a number of these kinds of reactions that take place in, for example, in the ceramic industry, or even in chemical industries such as cement manufacture, right? So where both the reactants are solids. So we are trying to look at how these reactions can be analyzed from a macroscopic angle, without worrying too much about how actually molecules move and diffuse and so on and so forth. Can we understand some broad characteristics of these kinds of reactions from a top level kind of an approach? So the candidate systems we are looking at here are calcium alumina systems, which, as I will explain, have some interesting features for these kinds of applications of theories. Continuing on the theme of multi-phase reactions, the reaction and reactor modeling uses various kinds of approaches these days. The existence of the emergence of this field called as computational fluid dynamics modeling has helped the understanding of multi-phase reactions, particularly when you have fluid phases involved, to a great extent. And that is because in any chemical reactor, one of the major ways in which I talked about the ways in which the reaction environment or the reactor influences the behavior of the reaction itself, right? So one of the major ways in which this happens is because of the way in which substances mix, the rate at which substances mix and unmix. And all of this can be analyzed very neatly using computational fluid dynamics tools. Some years ago, maybe 20-30 years ago, it was very difficult to analyze these kinds of mixing phenomena because, number one, the fluid mechanics equations, the Navier-Stokes equations, which have to be solved, are very, very complicated, nonlinear, and all of that. And added to that, they have to be solved in very complicated geometries. If you take a stir tank reactor, there is a stirrer and there are baffles, and so there is the gas inlet, and there is the free surface which itself is not flat, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of complications in the geometry which have to be handled, and thanks to the advances in computational tools and computational power, we are now able to solve these equations, not exactly, but under some assumptions. After all, turbulence is still very much a subject in which a lot of research is going on. The final word has not been said on that. Therefore, certain assumptions have to be made, but people in various circumstances, it is now known as to what kind of assumptions are reasonable, and therefore computational fluid dynamic modeling has been increasingly used both in industrial research as well as in academic research. So we have been looking at CFD modeling of chemical reactors in the context of underground coal gasification. We will talk about what it is, stirred reactor, combustion furnaces, and so on. One of the ways of intensifying, process intensification is of course a very, very dominant theme in chemical engineering in general. How to get reactions to, how to get processes to occur at faster rates, how to intensify the rates and so on. And one of the ways in which reactive processes can be intensified is to combine the separation along with the reaction, right? Normally the reaction produces something, and often reactions are limited by equilibrium, and therefore the reaction gets to an equilibrium and then stops. The conversion at equilibrium may be small, maybe 10%, maybe 15% depending on the temperature. And one of the ways in which the reaction can be driven forward is to continuously drive the reaction in the forward direction by removing the products. Okay, so combining separations with reactions has these advantages, and we have been, particularly Professor Sanjay Mahajani's group in our department has been looking at reactive distillation and reactive chromatography in very intensive ways, and applying them to reactions such as methyl acetate formation, dimerizations, and so on. So some of the themes are mentioned there. Coming to catalysis research, the kind of questions that we ask is, what determines catalyst activity and selectivity? Of course, there is the as I mentioned, there is the density functional theory, which tries to explain these from very fundamental quantum mechanical kind of principles, but those kinds of calculations are very complicated, especially for dense systems such as liquids. So we might want to take an experimental route to finding out what makes for a high activity and selectivity of the catalyst. One of the themes that has been emerging in recent years is that the catalyst cluster size has a substantial influence on the catalytic properties of the catalytic substance. For example, till recently it was not gold was not considered a good catalyst. Gold was considered an inert metal, but recent advances have shown that when you subdivide gold to nanometer clusters, it has very interesting catalytic properties, very selective kind of properties for a number of reaction systems. So catalyst cluster size effects, and once you have a catalyst, you cannot rest easy that I have found this catalyst and therefore it has I can conduct now my reaction and make a lot of money, because you have to, in order to use this, you have to support the catalyst on some kind of a support which has a high surface area. Silica and alumina you might have seen being used as supports in a number of instances. This support has an influence on the catalytic property. It might promote the catalytic activity, it might inhibit the catalytic activity. So the same metal, for example platinum or palladium, might show one kind of behavior when it is supported on carbon, it might show another kind of behavior when it is supported on alumina, a third kind of behavior when it is supported on silica, and so on and so forth. So finding the right support becomes important. And then there are synergistic and antagonistic reactions among catalytic sites. So the support itself might have catalytic sites, or you might have two catalytic elements having been supported on the same kind of support, or a physical mixture of two catalysts, as I mentioned in the case of automotive catalysis. There is the platinum catalyst, there is the rhodium catalyst, and the behavior of the activity of one catalyst influences the activity of the other catalyst. So these kinds of synergistic and antagonistic reactions. The second thing is what influences catalytic reaction pathways. Now this is a very complicated matter, because there are reactions which are taking place on the catalyst surface, there are reactions which are taking place in the bulk of the fluid, and each of these, by way of generating certain kinds of intermediates and consuming them, each of these kinds of reactions can influence the other. And so these kinds of external influences, or the influence of other catalysts, whether intentionally added or whether accidental, that becomes important. And reactive intermediates and their stabilization. So this is basically related to the earlier question of what determines catalytic activity. Then how do we model catalytic systems? You may be in your reaction engineering courses, you might have come across very simple kinds of models where, whether there is a catalyst or not, you apply power law kinetics, K into Ca to the power alpha, Cb to the power beta type of thing, where the catalyst only influences the magnitude and temperature dependence of the reaction rate constant, K. That is the first level of modeling. If you want to go deeper, you can derive a Langmuir-Hinshelwood kind of a mechanism, or you can postulate a Langmuir-Hinshelwood kind of a mechanism. You can say that the catalyst first complexes with reactant A, produces an active species, which then either reacts with another another surface species or a species in the bulk, and so on and so forth. You can construct a series of steps and analyze them with the assumption of one of the steps being rate limiting, or the system being in a quasi steady state, and so on and so forth. There are various simplifications which allow you to analyze this kind of a network, and then come up with reaction rate expressions, which typically have a numerator and a denominator, which is a sum of several terms, right? So you might have seen these kinds of reaction rate models. So this is a second level of modeling. A more detailed level of modeling is what is called as microkinetic modeling, where you talk about all the surface species that are possible, that are suggested by chemistry, and then you don't make assumptions like quasi steady state or reaction, rate limiting reactions, and so on and so forth. You analyze the entire network, but obviously when you do this, there is a horrendous number of rate constants and their activation energies and so on, which if they are not known, then there is no point in building such a detailed model, because everything has to be fitted from reaction data. But fortunately, because of the availability of quantum mechanical calculations these days, at least in some instances, we are able to guess reasonable values of some of these parameters. Therefore, microkinetic modeling becomes feasible. And if we can do all of this in a systematic way, then that can point the way towards efficient catalyst design. The candidate systems in which we look at these kinds of questions are liquid phase oxidations, biodiesel, and so on and so forth. The third or the fourth area that we look at is the area of I have grouped a few themes here: complex phenomena, biomimicry, and electrochemical processes. They are all complex in one sense or another, so they all fit under one heading. When we talk about complex phenomena, this is usually generated in chemical reaction systems because of the nonlinearity of the systems. Nonlinearity arises in two ways: because of the nonlinearity of the kinetics, the nonlinear ways in which the reactions depend on reactant concentrations and product concentrations. After all, first order reactions are more the exception than the rule, right? First orders are the only reactions which are linear. On the other hand, there is also the nonlinearity that is due to the Arrhenius dependence of reaction rates on temperature. Okay, so you can have when these kinds of nonlinearities exist, the equations predict that very interesting kinds of behavior from a theoretical viewpoint can arise. From a practical viewpoint also, these are important, because under these kinds of when the system is exhibiting these kinds of behavior, it might show entirely different kinds of selectivity features and rate features, which may be important from a practical point of view. So we are looking at some of these systems, and as I mentioned earlier, there is a tendency these days to look at biology when we are stuck for an answer, right? So after all, nature has been at it for millions of years, and it has found things that we are still struggling to learn. Therefore, modeling biological networks in order to understand how signaling takes place, how control of reaction pathways happens there, how the very complicated networks are regulated and conducted in a very coherent kind of a manner. So these are important issues that we can learn from nature. Electrochemical reaction engineering, I mentioned that it's a very attractive alternative to heating the reaction mixture to a high temperature, for example, or finding a very efficient catalyst, because one of the ways in which you can tune reactions is to conduct them at a certain definite potential, so you can drive certain reactions while leaving the other reactions alone. So you can derive interesting selectivity features. I will talk a little bit about bipolar catalysis and electrochemical synthesis in the next few slides. Okay, so in the next few slides I will try to illustrate the kind of approaches that we take in reaction engineering research on all of the themes that we went through in the earlier slides. Often, the research proceeds as in the case of, you might have heard the story of blind men trying to understand the shape of an elephant. Okay, one fellow touches the stomach of the elephant and he comes to a certain impression. One touches the legs and comes to a different impression. So often we are in that position when a new phenomenon is seen by experimentation. In order to explain that, you have to examine that phenomenon from various angles, okay, and then try to put together all of this understanding in order to gain an insight into what exactly is at the bottom of this. So this can be illustrated from the case of mass transfer properties of nanofluids, to which I made a reference earlier also. Nanofluids, as shown in that figure, is just another name for a colloidal suspension of insoluble nanoscale particulate material in a conventional solvent, maybe water, maybe another organic solvent, etc. What is important about this is that in the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of literature has accumulated which says that these nanofluids have properties which are very different, number one from the base fluid in which the nanoparticles are suspended, and number two from what is predicted by theories which are available for predicting the properties of suspensions from the properties of the individual components of the suspension. So those theories don't seem to work, and these seem to have properties which are very different from what is predicted. So we observed this in the case of mass transfer, where we found that the mass transfer rates in suspensions are very higher, are much higher as compared to the mass transfer rates in base solvents. And there are theories where mass transfer enhancements are expected when you have particles which are finer than the diffusion film thickness suspended in the liquid. But those theories seem to underpredict by a large magnitude the kind of enhancements that we see in mass transfer. Now, one of the problems with understanding mass transfer is that in any conventional kind of a mass transfer device, for example a bubble column or a stirred reactor in which you are bubbling a gas and then looking at the rate at which mass is transferred from the gas to the liquid, or the rate at which liquid is evaporating to the gas on the other end, there are two factors involved. One is the mass transfer coefficient KL, and the other one is the interfacial area, right? So it is the product of these KLA, or what is called as the volumetric mass transfer coefficient, that ultimately decides the rates. But the parameters or the features that influence the mass transfer coefficient are entirely different from what kind of properties influence the interfacial area. So when we come to something that has not been seen in the past, such as these peculiar mass transfer properties, we ask the question whether it is a mass transfer coefficient that is being influenced or whether it is only the interfacial area, which can be influenced in various other ways. So in order to understand that, we have to go back to model apparatus. We have to go away from the conventional kinds of bubble columns and stir tanks and so on. And the advantage of the model apparatus is that the hydrodynamics is very well defined, the interfacial area is fixed, and therefore you can study the mass transfer coefficient in isolation from the other complicating phenomena. So when we do that, there is a method of analyzing these data which use the occurrence of a reaction which has a certain kind of rate in relation to mass transfer. Okay? If the reaction is too fast, then its rate does not matter. If the reaction is too slow, then mass transfer doesn't matter, so you cannot understand what is happening to mass transfer. On the other hand, somewhere in the middle, the reaction rate and the mass transfer rate both matter, and there is a way of analyzing this. This was first proposed by Danckwerts in the 1950s, where you can plot the absorption results in a certain way, and the slope of these lines that result is dependent on the interfacial area, and the intercepts are dependent on the mass transfer coefficient. So if you look at some of the data which are there, it is clear that the lines are parallel, so the interfacial area is constant, of course, which it has to be in a wetted wall column unless there is rippling and factors like that. So this shows that the conditions are satisfactory. On the other hand, the intercepts are dependent on the size of the particles and the volume fraction of the particles. Now, okay, so there seems to be an effect of the nanoparticles on the mass transfer coefficient. Now, when you talk about the mass transfer coefficient, the mass transfer coefficient is influenced by hydrodynamics, it is influenced by molecular phenomena such as diffusion. For example, if you take something as simple as the film theory, it tells you that KL is equal to D by delta, right? So where D is the diffusivity and delta is the film thickness, right? So now, is the hydrodynamics different in the presence of nanoparticles, or is the molecular process itself influenced in some way? That is the next question. So we want to conduct this reaction in special designs of apparatus, specially designed apparatus, where we get rid of the flow altogether. So some of those kinds of equipment we have designed. So for example, here what we do is we just trap a gas bubble in between two solvents, and the conditions are such that it can only dissolve in one direction, and when that happens the bubble shrinks and you can follow the size of the bubble and get some information on the rates of absorption. So these kinds of results once again showed that even in the absence of flow, unlike in the case of wetted wall columns where there is flow, even in the absence of flow there is a substantial influence of the nanoparticles on the mass transfer rates. So is it the molecular process then? When we talk about the molecular process, this is not a very satisfactory way of understanding that, because there is gas, there is liquid, there is solid matter. The solid matter might have a tendency to accumulate at the interface, so that might have its own influences. It may not be uniformly dispersed. Therefore, we construct another apparatus which is entirely there are two miscible liquids, so there are none of these interface related issues that become important here, and we try to put a tracer solution in contact with a normal fluid with which it is miscible, and try to follow the development of concentration profiles. The other factor that is important is the influence of scale at which you apply your reaction engineering principles. I talked about the influence of pi stack. So I mentioned the occurrence of pi stacking in aromatic systems and how this influences the rates of a reaction such as nitration. So in order to so what we are essentially saying is that when you have aromatic molecules, they can sit on top of one another, something like a polymerization, but this is what is called as stacking, so that the pi electrons can move continuously across different molecules, and this confers some kind of stability. Now aromatic molecules are stable because of the resonance stabilization of the bonding electrons, but this confers a higher degree of stability on the aromatic molecules, so they become even less reactive, so the rates of reaction are not very high. On the other hand, if you study the phenomenon carefully, there is a kinetics to the stacking. There is a rate at which the stacking takes place. Now if you can get the molecules to react before they stack up, maybe you can derive benefits in terms of rates. So that stacking is taking place can be analyzed in terms of proton NMR, as I said, and it also manifests itself in terms of large increases in solubility of the aromatic when the stacking phenomenon takes place. So how do we conduct a reaction? How do we mix the nitrating mixture with the aromatic faster than the stacking kinetics is? So we can do this in, for example, something like a stop flow reactor, and this is a micro reactor which allows us to do that. So basically you have two conduits which are joining at a point, and you flow the two solutions at very high rates, and they mix and then react. So when you do this, the rates jump by a factor of as much as 100. So this shows that sufficient care needs to be taken in engineering equipment for these kinds of reactions, so that the reaction or mixing can be conducted can be carried out at a rate that is much faster than stacking occurs, and therefore you can derive the benefits of rates. So these are experiments done on a micro scale, and how you translate this, how you engineer a macroscopic system in which reactions can actually be carried out on a large scale is another matter altogether, right? So there are other issues involved, and mixing is not something that is very simple to scale up anyway. We know that from several examples, right? Certain other kinds of reactions we investigate, we may not need to go to such small scales to understand. Lab or pilot scale equipment may be sufficient, and the example in this particular instance is of a reactive distillation, which is for which we have Professor Sanjay Mahajani's group has set up reactors which you can say are of a pilot scale, and you can derive you can construct models and fit the models to the experimental data and develop a certain level of confidence in the application of those models. There are other situations in the real world which it is very difficult to scale down, basically what you do is, if in order to understand something that is happening in the real world, you bring it down to a scale where you can conduct that, you can operate that system in the laboratory or on your bench, right? Some reaction systems are very difficult to scale down because of certain features that they have. The example here is of an underground coal gasification, which is a technique that is being actively looked at in several parts of the world in order to convert coal seams which are difficult to mine in place. Okay, you can, it's difficult to extract this coal and then subject this to combustion, gasification, etc. Over the ground. Therefore, you leave the coal in place, you inject oxygen and steam or air and steam, and you conduct the gasification in situ, and the gases that come out are synthesis gas, carbon monoxide, hydrogen and so on, which have a certain calorific value which can be burnt, and you can produce chemicals from it, you can produce energy from it, whatever. Now, so because this is happening under the ground, certain kinds of cavities are generated as the coal is converted, as the coal is combusted and gasified and so on, and that is very difficult to mimic in the laboratory. We can do it up to a certain stage. Therefore, of course, when we do whatever we can in the laboratory, construct similar kinds of geometries and study the reaction and so on, what we also try to do is model the, using CFD tools, model the geometry that actually develops under the ground. And so some of these examples are from that kind of work. Another issue that often becomes important is, while large scale manufacture is strongly dependent on steady state behavior of reactors, there are interesting kinds of dynamic behavior which might have important consequences on the operability or the safety of operation of these kinds of reactor systems. So what is shown here is a continuous reactive distillation system, where of course there is a catalytic system that that is responsible for the reaction and so on, but it is the study overall, one is interested in the steady state behavior of this. But these kinds of catalytic packed beds have their own idiosyncrasies, have their own nonlinearities, which can affect the overall performance of the system in various ways. So I have a video here from Professor Ganesh Vishwanathan's work, which shows that in a catalytic packed bed, because of the nonlinear interaction between the mass balance and energy balance that occurs, you have patterns developing So if you see that video, what is being shown here is a packed bed, which is in which the flow is in that direction from bottom to top, and what you see developing are hot temperature zones, hot zones, right, which travel through the reactor and exit. What you are, of course, this is not something that you can poke thermometers all over the bed and measure. What you actually measure is the mixed cup concentration at the top, and no, that hides a lot of features. Okay, there is a lot that is happening here. You may have hot zones developing in the interior of the reactor, which might sinter the catalyst, which might deactivate the catalyst, and so on and so forth. So the reactor will not give you the performance that you expect it to give. So catalysis, in some sense, is the holy grail of reaction engineering. Everybody wants a catalyst that does wonders to your rate and selectivity. And as I mentioned a few slides ago, it is not something that we can design from first principles yet. Unfortunately, except in very simple cases, we are not able to, given a reaction, we are not able to immediately identify which element in the periodic table is best suited to catalyze that reaction. We depend on earlier experience, knowledge that has been gained over the years for similar kinds of reactions and so on, and we shortlist a set of compounds, a set of materials, which we test and then narrow down the the list of elements, and then there is the whole issue of supporting this and then making the catalyst in a form that can be used in an industrial reactor. Then there are the issues of support interactions and so on, right? So catalyst synthesis is an important area which is very much of an art. Okay, you have to mix the ingredients in a certain manner under a certain set of conditions, and there are a lot of things that can happen which can have a significant influence on the catalytic activity. For example, what is the size of the metallic clusters, how are they distributed, what is the porosity, what is the percentage of porosity that is hidden in micropores, which are nanometer size and which may pose diffusion limitations for the reactant molecules. All of these things are determined by the way in which the catalyst is synthesized. Now, having synthesized the catalyst, in order to understand what kind of features the catalyst that you have synthesized has, you have to characterize it in various ways, and this is an area in which new instruments are coming on the market every day, new techniques are being developed. For example, till a few years ago, or till maybe 10 or 20 years ago, the technique of X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy was not something that was routinely used in catalysis. Today they are trying to use, it is used very routinely. People try to talk about binding energies and so on and so forth. So there are other characterization methods such as BET is something that you might already be familiar with, in which by absorbing a molecule such as nitrogen, you try to understand the extent of surface that is available in the catalyst. And then there are pulse chemisorption, there are temperature programmed desorption, oxidation, reduction. All these techniques allow us to understand the strength of the catalytic activity of the catalytic cluster. And then there are other techniques such as FTIR, X-ray diffraction and so on. So there's a whole suite of analytical techniques which is a very specialized field in itself, and chemists enter into it, chemical engineers enter into it, physicists enter into it. So there's a lot of multidisciplinarity about this business of characterizing the catalyst and understanding and interpreting the results from these various kinds of equipments. So having synthesized it, having characterized it, then you have to look at its performance in a reactor, which allows you to separate the kinetics from other factors such as transport factors in a reasonable manner. So stirred reactors, spinning basket kind of reactors are used, and then you will find these kinds of results where you will see that the same kind of, for example, palladium, in this case it is the effect of palladium on glycerol oxidation. Now glycerol oxidation has a complex chemistry, a number of products are formed, both series and parallel reaction networks are involved, and you will see that both activity and selectivity of the same palladium metal depends very strongly on how it is supported. Okay, if you support it on alumina versus if you support it on carbon versus if you support it on titania, you get very different kinds of results. So maybe I'll fast forward a bit. Okay, so I'll talk briefly about this, but more information you can ask from Professor Ganesh if you are interested, because this is part of his work. So as I said, when we are kind of confronted with even a simple network, it seems very complicated to us, but nature seems to carry on very complicated reactions in networks in the space of micronic dimensions of a cell very, very efficiently. So there's maybe a lot we can learn from how nature does this. A particular instance or two particular instances of this from Professor Ganesh's work are illustrated here. Now, when often you want a switch-like response to a signal, right? So it's either on or off. That kind of a response is what is needed, not a gradual kind of a build-up of the response. Now this seems to be very characteristic of enzymatic cascades or biological systems, and research has shown, earlier research has shown, that these kinds of stacking of these kinds of modules is what is behind these kinds of switch-like responses. Now a related issue there is that so what is happening here is that there is an enzyme which phosphorylates a chemical X to its phosphorylated or active equivalent X star. X star can be regarded as the active form of X, and this X star itself is an enzyme which catalyzes the transformation of an inactive molecule Y to an active molecule Y star, and then the dephosphorylation or inactivation of these X star and Y star is catalyzed by other enzymes P1 and P2. These kinds of themes occur repeatedly in enzymatic signal transduction, and you can see that if you look at the response as a function of the enzyme number, this enzyme number, the response in Y star is very sharp, whereas the response in X star is more gradual. Now an attendant issue here, this is of course this has been established in earlier work also, but an attendant issue here is that when the signal is being amplified, so what is happening here is over a very small increase in E naught, the number of molecules of enzyme, the response is amplified, right? A small signal is amplified to a significant output. Now when the signal is being amplified, what is happening to the noise that is attendant on this with the signal, that is mixed with the signal? That is the other issue. And so if the cell is confused by the noise also being amplified to the same extent as the signal, then there is a problem, right? So this talks about the noise amplification or noise attenuation. So so this work establishes the conditions under which the noise is modulated or noise is bounded. Now, okay, I will not talk about this for want of time, but this is again an instance of interlinked feedback loops which deliver certain kinds of interesting features such as oscillatory phenomena and so on. I will skip this. Okay, the general theme I want to illustrate in the next couple of slides is that there are some very traditional themes that you would have come across in your reaction engineering courses also. When rate processes take place in series, we know that the slowest rate controls, right? So we talk about the rate limiting step and so on. So a general theme that runs through much of reaction engineering is that of diffusion and reaction. Okay, so these may be taking place in parallel simultaneously, or diffusion may be followed by reaction or whatever, right? Now this is a very old thing. There are results on diffusion reaction which date back maybe about 100 years or so. But even today you can come across instances of where this principle is at work. Okay, so that is why the quote there is from Macbeth. Some of you might recognize it. So you would not normally expect such an old theme to have relevance even today, but then it has a lot of stuff in it. So we have seen in complex oxidations such as cyclohexane that under some circumstances where mass transfer starts to influence, this is a reaction in which the reaction gradually speeds up as the products accumulate. So there is an autocatalysis that is involved. So this is what is being plotted here is the oxygen level in the liquid. So this is at saturation, and then it gradually decreases, and just as it gets down to near zero levels, it starts to oscillate. Now the importance of this, of course, this is of theoretical interest, but it is of practical interest as well, because we have found that the selectivity of the oxidation is better under this oscillatory regime than it is in the purely kinetic or purely mass transfer limited regime. Now this is an isothermal case, and there is no coupling between the energy balance and the mass balance that is invoked in, for example, when you analyze the multiplicity of steady states and stability of steady states in a non-isothermal CSTR in your reaction engineering courses. So we try to understand this through a mechanism that invokes this paradigm of diffusion and reaction. Okay, so I will not go into the details, but it shows the relevance of some of the traditional themes in present day instances. I'll just give one example of a situation which is very common in industry, but on which not much theoretical work exists. This is a case where both of the reactants are solids, and in that case what is normally done is you know the situation where a solid particle is surrounded by a gaseous or a liquid reactant. So you have the shrinking core type of models. Okay, you recall the shrinking core type of models where you could have gas film controlled situations, reaction controlled situations, ash film controlled situations. You would have seen all that. Now this is the situation which is descriptive of, this is the equation that describes how a shrinking core kinetics works in the case of a gas solid reaction. Now the same kind of equation has been used in solid solid reactions as well, but actually when you think about it, the solids can can be in contact in a finite number of points like this, not throughout the circumference or throughout the external surface, right. So we have been trying to understand this. So when you apply for a situation like this, when you apply the traditional kind of models, and if you see this left hand side is being plotted versus the right hand side here without the diffusivity, so you would expect that all of these should give you the same straight line, because nothing else is different, the radius is the same, and the conversion time behavior therefore should follow this equation. But you don't get it. But what you get is that depending on the number of points of contact, you get a different value of diffusivity. So clearly diffusivity cannot depend on the physical feature of how the bed is packed or how the particles are contacted, and therefore you need to analyze this situation in greater detail, and some of those models will give you more realistic kind of descriptions. So this is just to, so we'll skip this. I think we are, how much time do I have? Another 5 minutes. Okay, so we'll skip this. Yeah, so I mentioned electrochemistry. So under several circumstances, mixing electricity and chemistry could give you could have advantages for you, because you can tune reactions by controlling the potential and drive certain reactions in the absence of or to the detriment of other reactions, improve selectivity, and so on and so forth. There are also devices like fuel cells which are very important, batteries, the fuel cells for generation of electricity and batteries for storage of electricity, and these are very important in today's context. And we are also looking at electrosynthesis and electrooxidation. Now one of the themes that Professor Arindam Sarkar's group looks at is, can you if you look at oxidation chemistry in a fuel cell, you take a substance and oxidize it all the way to carbon dioxide, and in the process generate some electricity and so on. Now instead of oxidizing it all the way to carbon dioxide, can you partially oxidize it so that you get some electricity but you also get valuable chemicals? So simultaneous synthesis of energy and chemicals is a theme that is being studied here. Now by electrodeposition, you can create these kinds of core shell structures where you deposit a very thin layer of catalytic element, in this case platinum, on a substrate which in this case is platinum copper alloy, or it may even be copper supported on carbon. Now the way in which the surface layer arranges itself is influenced by the crystallinity of the crystal dimensions of the crystal habit of the underlying layer, and therefore there could be stresses in the surface layer which promote its catalytic activity. So some of these kinds of themes are also being looked at. Okay, so let me skip this and go to the kind of facilities that are needed to pursue reaction engineering research. For the micro analysis that I mentioned, we often depend on equipment such as thermogravimetric analyzer, differential scanning calorimeters, differential mechanical analyzers, and so on. So these kinds of equipments are important in analyzing the you study the reaction in a very small sample, milligram quantities of samples. And then for catalyst characterization, I mentioned temperature programmed desorption, pulse chemisorption, etc. I don't know, have they already had a tour of the lab? So you might have seen some of these equipment actually. There is the Brunauer Emmett Teller, or BET apparatus as it is known, which is a very classical kind of a technique for determining the surface area. Of course, it has been refined in recent years so that you can calculate a lot of other quantities such as microporosity, pore size distribution, and so on. And then a number of reactor and reactor separator systems where you conduct the reactions on a larger scale. In a thermogravimetric analyzer, you are handling milligram quantities, but you can handle liters of substance, or several grams, even up to a kilogram of material in these kinds of reactor separator systems. Then of course you will need the one important thing about any chemical reaction engineering research is that you have to have a good method of analysis in order to close the carbon balance or close the material balance in general, and have faith in the conversions and rate expressions that you derive. So a lot of analytical instrumentation is required, and again for catalyst characterization and for various other in the case of interfacial polycondensation that I mentioned, the kind of surface features or the internal features that the polymer film ends up having, you depend on electron microscopy, transmission electron microscopy, SEM, etc. Then there are, for the electrochemical work, there are potentiostats, galvanostats, etc. Then on an even larger scale, if you want to conduct the reactions and then look at the feasibility of the process development possibilities, then we have a biodiesel pilot plant which is operated by Professor Mahajani's group, where a variety of feedstocks are converted to biodiesel and the kinetics of that at a reasonable scale are studied. And then you of course require software tools. Apart from a variety of software that is today available on open source, we also have proprietary software such as Fluent, COMSOL, etc., which allow you to do CFD type of work. And then MATLAB is a very general computational platform on which a variety of computational work can be done. So the kind of research challenges in all of this, of course by no means this is comprehensive, that is what the last bullet indicates, but some of the challenges that I can think of is of course rational catalyst design from first principles. I mean, this is a goal that is still pretty much in the future, right? We are nowhere near being able to design catalysts from first principles, but that is the road in which, that is the direction in which to proceed. Now kinetic models, how complex to make them? When you look at some of these examples that I have given, for example underground coal gasification, there is a whole host of reactions which are taking place, or when you look at automotive catalysis in detail in a microkinetic framework, then there are so many reaction intermediates, so many molecular species, etc. And if you make the reaction system too complicated, you might have a realistic system, but you know nothing about the parameters, and somebody said that with 5 parameters you can easily fit an elephant, right? So it doesn't work, because you cannot have a confidence in a model of that kind. Therefore this issue of the kind of complexity that you can handle in terms of the data that you can collect is an important one to consider. In handling complex reaction networks, the way in which we analyze these kinds of networks, the way in which we study and learn from the architecture of these networks, can we learn from biology? This is a dominant theme. Process intensification, as I mentioned, is something that everybody talks about these days, and in this micro-reaction technology has a role to play. Reaction separation systems, combining reactions and separations, enhancing the dominant transport steps in various ways. So all of these are themes that go into process intensification. A major driver of reaction engineering research is the consideration of impact on energy, environment, and sustainability. For example, we are looking at clean coal technologies. Given that we have to depend on coal in the foreseeable future to fulfill our energy needs, how to minimize the impact of burning coal on the environment. So there is a whole field of clean coal technology, right? So people say that coal and clean, these two words cannot be mentioned in the same sentence, because coal is by nature dirty. But then how to do this so that the environmental impact is mitigated to whatever extent it can be. Okay, so there's a whole alphabet soup of techniques that people are looking at. Underground coal gasification is something that I mentioned. There is an emphasis on carbon capture and storage, because there is a lot of interest in reducing the carbon dioxide outgress into the environment and so on. I've given some examples of putting electrochemistry to work. Now there is a lot of areas in which chemical reaction engineering can play a part. It is playing a part, but in my opinion not to the extent that it can. So for example, in photovoltaic materials and other electronic materials, there is a lot of reaction engineering that goes on, but chemical engineers don't as a rule look at these kinds of systems. There is a lot of potential to improve the engineering of these kinds of processes. Biofuels, biorefinery, once again, I mentioned photovoltaic materials in the context of energy, what role chemical reaction engineering can play in energy related material synthesis, and biofuels, biorefinery also in the same context, and benign substitutes for polluting chemicals. We have had a number of examples. For example, there was lead was taken out of petrol and then MTBE was put in, then MTBE had its own problems, now that has been taken out. So replacing substitutes, replacing polluting chemicals in the refrigerating industry, we had CFCs, okay, carbon fluorochemicals, which have now gone out of fashion. So all of these kinds of themes in the interest of sustainability and environment, and general drive towards safer, cleaner processes, reducing the wastage, okay, zero discharge kind of processes, and so on. Okay, so these are some of the research challenges that I might mention. So just to conclude, I think I have taken a lot of time. So reaction engineering continues to be an exciting field with a number of challenges, and as I said, chemical engineers are uniquely placed to play a part in it, because a systematic study of chemical reaction engineering is only found in a chemical engineering curriculum, in no other engineering curriculum. CRE has yet to realize its full potential in terms of the difference it can make to non-chemical engineering areas such as energy, electronics. I mentioned some examples, but there are a number of these kinds of instances where principles of reaction engineering can give you insights that you cannot otherwise get. The traditional driving forces for rate and selectivity are being shaped in the current, by the current emphasis on energy efficiency, cleaner processes, sustainable strategies, and so on. Now, traditional areas and methods of analysis continue to yield rich dividends. While there is all this diversification that is going on, chemical engineers getting into other areas, you still recall some of the undergraduate level material that you have studied, diffusion reaction, Thiele modulus, effectiveness factor. So these things can still give you a lot of insights in these kinds of areas, newer areas. At the same time, hybridization of ideas from other fields has rich potential. So you, on the one hand, you have the foundation from your undergraduate and postgraduate studies on which you stand, but then you imbibe, you get into electrochemistry, for example. There is a whole new set of, a whole new domain of knowledge to imbibe from. You get into catalysis, the chemistry of catalysts, or you get into electronics, materials. So there is the other domain knowledge also has to seep in, hybridize with the knowledge that you already have in your basic chemical reaction engineering, and only then you can make differences to the field in which you work. So these are the people whose work I have highlighted in some of the earlier slides. There is Professor Juecker, of course, who you have seen. Professor Mehra is currently not around, but he also has an interest in reaction engineering. So that's me, and there is Professor Mahajani. He is also not here today. Professor Sarkar is also not here today. But these are the people. So Professor Sarkar and Juecker work on electrochemical systems. Professor Juecker and Mahajani work on polynitrations and that class of reactions. And Professor Vishwanathan works in complexity in biological systems as well as in chemical engineering systems. So that's the field of reaction engineering as represented in our department largely. Okay.
Core of chemical engineering. I'm sure you have. If you don't have, I have to write to the ask your, shoot your questions.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't get that.
Cost for that catalyst is more important, or time required for that reaction by using that catalyst is more important?
Cost? No, there is a cost involved, but ultimately it's an economic decision. For example, there are processes such as fluid catalytic cracking, which are unthinkable without the catalyst. free energy considerations tell you that of course the reaction will take place, but the kind of conditions that are necessary are very, very extreme. So in that case, there is a definite cost advantage in using the catalyst. But in many cases, the advantage in using the catalyst is more from the point of view of selectivity than from the point of view of rate. Of course, rate is also important, but in many cases, it significantly simplifies the product workup later on, because you are selectively producing certain chemicals. So the junk that you produce, which you have to separate and either recycle or send it to waste, is much less. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I can think of a couple of examples where you can precipitate out the catalyst. See, what happens in homogeneous catalysis is that every molecule, as you said, every molecule of the catalyst can exert its catalytic activity. Therefore, you use these homogeneous catalysts in very, very minute amounts. For example, in cyclohexane oxidation, you have a few hundred ppm of cobalt acetate, cobalt naphthenate type of catalyst. Now, therefore, separation of these becomes a problem. I mean, even if you precipitate it, you have colloidal precipitate that is dispersed, and then to separate it from the liquid becomes difficult. And then it produces when you separate the required products or desired products from the undesired products will have this catalyst also within them. And if you discharge them, there is the issue of environmental pollution. There is the of course, in terms of economical value, it may not be very significant because you are using it in such small amounts, but there is certainly the environmental implication. So, and that is also a very system dependent kind of thing, that being able to precipitate it. So, there are two things. One is precipitation may or may not be possible. Even if it is possible, because the precipitate is in such small amounts, separating that may not be an easy matter, right? Therefore, you go for heterogeneous catalysis, and when you do that, of course, there are very important homogeneously catalyzed processes where some of these issues are not important. But generally, the trend is towards heterogenization, where this business, you can pack the catalyst in a bed or fluidize it, and then your reactant fluid goes away. So the separation is not an issue at all. On the other hand, the issue of activity comes in. There could be diffusion limitations. So much of the engineering kind of research is in looking at the microstructure of catalyst particles, how to increase the activity, how to make maximum use of the catalytic atoms. Right? If you have a catalyst cluster, the atoms on the inside are of course not able to see the fluid and influence the reaction. So you reduce the cluster size, try to disperse it. So these are the kinds of themes that one looks at. Pulse chemisorption, yeah. So pulse chemisorption is a technique in which you again look at the adsorptive capacity of the catalyst by saturating the catalyst surface by administering pulses of an adsorbing substance. So this you can calculate the area and cluster size and things like that. And a kind of supplementary or complementary technique is that of temperature programmed desorption. So you saturate the surface, you adsorb a substance, and then you heat the catalyst in a programmed manner according to a temperature program, and then look at the temperature at which the adsorbed substance comes out by analyzing the gases that come out. So these are complementary techniques. So for example, I talked about the support interaction, right? A substance might absorb on palladium and come out at a certain temperature, but due to interaction with the support, palladium when supported might the substance might dissolve from it at a higher temperature or a lower temperature. So these also give clues to the support interaction, these kinds of techniques. Huh? Clean coal technology. So in general, there are a number of themes that are being looked at. Some of them depend on the kind of coal as well. For example, as you may know, Indian coal has a large ash content, right? So that has its own issues in terms of particulate matter, mercury being sent into the atmosphere and so on. But in general, one is looking at post-combustion capture versus pre-combustion capture. So this relates to carbon dioxide capture, right? So see, earlier years, the driving force for converting coal was to increase the efficiency. Now here what happens is, so you can get efficiencies from 30% when you gasify the coal and use the pressure as well as the calorific value separately. You can push up the efficiency to 40%. But then what happens is that the moment you put in a carbon capture system, that lowers the efficiency back again, because you have to put energy into carbon capture and sequestration, right? So, but then the world over there is a drive towards carbon capture and sequestration, adding these systems to this thing. So post combustion capture is, you burn the coal and then try to catch the carbon dioxide. In pre combustion capture, you use gasification, right? So integrated gasification and combined cycle, IGCC, is a technique that people are actively looking at in order to have efficient conversion of coal to energy, and also less impact in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. As far as combustion itself is concerned, once again, combustion at high pressures going up to supercritical conditions is a theme that is attracting a lot of attention. And then the clean coal technologies, a large part of that is addresses the whole issue of carbon dioxide capture and sequestration, right? Absorptive methods, other conversion methods, chemical conversion methods, and there is also a technique called as chemical looping, where you don't combust the coal, but you derive the energy through a chemical route. So these are all various themes which fit under clean coal technology. So some of these are not new, but coal research has not been in fashion for many years. Coal was there was enough oil and so on. There are two things that have happened. One is, of course, people are saying the petroleum supply is limited. The second thing is, so to get as much as you can out of the existing coal is of interest. Second thing is this whole business of whole emphasis on mitigating carbon dioxide, the climate greenhouse gases issue and so on. So these are the two issues which have brought coal research back into the forefront. Yeah. Ah. You want, Jivekar, you want to?
I didn't get exactly what do you mean by how to pursue this research. For that, you should have, of course, microreactor. So we are doing very simple reactions. What we do is we take microreactors, means your quantity should be small, amount that we process per unit time should be small. And second thing is, normally microreactors are useful because the volume to surface area to volume ratio becomes very large. So what we do simply is we use tubes which have very small diameter but very long tubes. So we mix it with small teas and after mixing you just pass it to the tube. We are not using even metal tubes, we just use plastic tubes, very long plastic tubes of very small diameter, and that heat transfer area is so large and the amount of heat evolved is so small that you can get isothermal reaction even though heat of reaction is very, very high. So, actually constructing a microreactor, if you want a simple microreactor in which you want to perform reaction, it's not very difficult. The problem will comes when you want to do reactions which are extremely fast, where you want very rapid mixing, because many times this so-called diffusion control reaction, they require extremely rapid mixing. So nowadays people have created mixers which are very, very efficient on small scale. So if you want to buy those are expensive elements. And suppose you want to multi-phase reactions, etc., require special design of these microreactors. If you have a method of constructing, because we have this nano lab where you can construct these elements. Otherwise, you purchase it. So those people who sell this kind of reactor, they sell it at very high price. The profit margins are quite high. So if you can afford it, you can do that. Otherwise, you try to construct very simple systems which may cater to your needs.
In gas liquid reaction system, there are different types of reactions like fast reaction, slow reaction, instantaneously fast reaction. Then we say in fast reaction that the reaction occurs in bulk of the liquid. Then what happens in instantaneously fast reaction? It occurs at the interface or where?
Yes, of course. So in very fast reaction, again there are two kinds of fast reactions. One is fast, very, very fast reaction. In that case, what happens as the reaction diffuses near the interface, before it goes into bulk, the reactions start occurring, which modulates its concentration profile. So normally, if reaction occurs in the bulk, the concentration profile near interface is linear because it's just diffusing in the interface, no reaction occurs. But once reaction starts occurring faster and faster, the profile near the interface, before it goes in the bulk, gets modified, it becomes more curved, and then the reaction can be so-called instantaneous. So instantaneous reactions are, for example, neutralization reactions, acid-base reactions. They are so fast that as soon as two reactants meet each other, the reaction occurs. So such reactions occurs almost in a plane. So in that case, what happens? Near the interface, you have two zones formed. On one side, only one reactant exists. For example, gas phase reactant exists on one side, and on the other side, the reactant exists. So they both diffuse to that plane and then react. So again, you will find that the diffusion there plays very important role. So you have these two types of reactions, fast and instantaneous.
Sir, how we can stop the undesired product or minimize the undesired product in heterogeneous catalysis, though the catalyst is selective?
If catalyst is selective, you do not have undesired product. So ultimately, it depends upon how do you perform the reactions. So you have to study kinetics. Suppose there is a consecutive reaction or two parallel reactions. You should find out the condition in which one of the reactions gets higher. You cannot avoid completely side reactions. You can minimize it because if side reaction is to occur, it has to occur. But what extent? It is by just changing the condition. So it depends upon type of reaction. There can't be any universal solution. So depending upon the reaction, you study the reaction, find out what are the side reactions, under what conditions they occur, and then we try to adjust conditions so that they occur to a smallest extent. So it depends upon type of reaction. I cannot give you an answer which is one answer to your question.
before we take next question, I request Mr. Ganesh to say a little more about his research. I think Mr. Suresh explained his research, but maybe you can say
Well, reaction engineering actually spans across many different fields which Professor Suresh has explained, and more so in healthcare, because everything that happens inside a tiny cell is biochemical reaction. And all the principles that we have studied in chemical engineering, they're all applicable to everything that's happening inside the cell. For example, diffusion, transport, convection to a very small extent inside the cell, but outside the cell convection actually happens. So what we do in our lab is we try to look at different kinds of biochemical we try to study biochemical reactions, particularly with respect to looking at response of drugs to cancer, certain types of cancer. And some of the drugs don't work. Most of you know that not all cancers are curable. And so the question comes in as to why it doesn't work. And if we answer that question, then we will be able to answer as to what needs to be done in order to make it to work. So that kind of questions we are trying to answer, and by putting it in the framework of a biochemical network, and by studying how the dynamics of the biochemical network actually is changing with respect to time, depending upon the dosage of the drug, so on and so forth. So one of the networks that Professor Suresh showed is basically a smaller form of a biochemical network which is strongly responding to a drug called tumor necrosis factor, which is used for different types of carcinomas and lymphomas. So, in fact, you will see that.
Yeah.
So, in fact, you will see on the right side picture here. You will see there's the concentration of phospho-ERK. P stands for phosphorylation event, and ERK is the protein which is responsible for proliferation of cells. Proliferation means the cells are actually uncontrollably dividing. So ERK is known to be one of the proteins which actually controls the uncontrollable division, and as a result of which the cancer progression is significant. So here you can see that it actually undergoes an oscillatory behavior where the concentration goes up and goes down. So which means that it sort of reflects the transient with which the cancer cells are behaving. So the question here would be, what we would want to know is, if the cells are treated with a certain drug, can we suppress the concentration of phospho-ERK by looking at the dynamics of the network? So that's the grand question. So if we can suppress it, then we actually stop the cells from dividing uncontrollably, and so we arrest the progression of cancer. So that's basically the objective, and the network that you see is just a miniaturized version of a large network. The large network that actually controls in this particular problem has about 350 species and about 400 interactions. But this just captures a tiny part of it, which is known to be responsible for an important aspect, which is the proliferation of the cells. So that's basically the quick summary of the right-hand side. And in fact, what you see here on the left-hand side is actually a small component of the network that you see on the right. Is there a pointer somewhere? You see, this MEK and ERK is basically two proteins which go from inactive to active form, and it's actually an enzymatic cascade. And what you see here is basically opened up a larger version of all the details of biochemistry that happens inside here. So this kind of amplification actually happens in different sections of the network, and there are feedback loops which are present here. So they modulate the response, and so the question is how the feedback loop is modulating, and can we attempt to tamper with the feedback loop? There are ways to tamper with the feedback loops. Can we tamper with the feedback loops and eventually control the concentration of the active form of ERK? So that's the grander question. I mean, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Yeah. Yeah, so you can. Yeah, I mean, these are questions that can be easily verified using some very simple experiments. For example, we know that in heat transfer we have seen that or heat transfer or mass transport, by analogies we know that the mass transport coefficient and the heat transport coefficient are a strong function of the hydrodynamic conditions. So we can actually play with the flow rate with which you are flowing things, and by that way you can actually control the mass transport rate. And then you measure the concentration or the rate at which the reaction is happening. You will be able to figure out whether it is mass transport or diffusion control. That's a very easy experiment to do. Yeah. Right. See, with respect to deciding whether it is internal diffusion control or mass transport control, this is particularly with reference to heterogeneous catalysis. You can simply increase the temperature. If you increase the temperature, you increase the diffusivity significantly, and so you will be able to figure out whether the reaction is happening at the intrinsic kinetics or the kinetics is falsified. And you conduct at normal temperature, you will be able to compare that and figure out whether it is diffusion controlled or not.
So we can take one more question.
Yeah.
So, as you say that clean coal technology and chemical combustion are the very old technologies for reduction of
You have to hold 3 now.
carbon on the environment. So what exactly the new approach of
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Clean coal technology, what is the word?
clean coal technology and the chemical looping combustion
Ah.
are the technologies to reduce the effect of carbon on the environment. So they are very old technologies from 1930 they are built. So
Well, yeah, not all are old, but for example, a lot of results which are coming up from research on supercritical combustion and all that are fairly new.
So what exactly the new approach? If we start the research on that, so what exactly the new approach?
So there are several things which are new. One is, of course, as I said, there are several new areas. The whole clean coal technology, one part of it is about carbon capture and sequestration. Sequestration possibilities in various kinds of whether ocean-based aquifers or whether land-based aquifers is what kind of mineralization takes place at what rates. All of this is new. I mean, it's being researched now. Capture once again, is nanofluid work that I talked about. It has potential in capture, and if it sees an industrial application, it will be something that nobody has used before. On the other hand, people are talking about direct conversion of carbon dioxide to chemicals, carbon dioxide to methanol, and so on and so forth. Reduction of carbon dioxide.
Capture CO2.
Huh?
Capture CO2 you are saying.
Yeah, this is capture. So that is, development of photocatalysts for this kind of conversion. And dope, for example, titania is known to be a photocatalyst, but you dope it with certain other elements so that its activity in relevant parts of the solar spectrum increases, and you that way capture the solar energy in a chemical form by converting carbon dioxide to methanol or other chemicals. So all these are new. There is a lot of work on algal bioconversion of carbon dioxide to maybe bio oils or even proteins and such other nutrient elements. On combustion itself, gasification, there is a lot of on control of gasifiers. There is a lot of work that is going on. I mean, gasification technology. What happens in gasification might have been known, but to engineer that to a process and get the best efficiency out of that is something. There is a lot of engineering issue that is involved there, which has not been addressed. What reactions take place is known, right? There is Bourgeois reaction, there is water gas shift, there is gas pyrolysis. All of this has been known for quite some time. But for example, when you talk about something like UCG, these same reactions interact in very different ways. Right? So as far as engineering is concerned, there is a whole host of things that are not understood. Yeah. Yeah, we can discuss over tea. Yeah, okay. Sorry? What is hotspot?
Well, there are many reasons. One is at least as of today, there is no way to get a uniform packing inside the reactor. There's no way to do that. When I say uniform packing, it means that you will never be able to make sure that you're able to pack the catalyst in the same fashion every time. And as a result, the activity of the catalyst is going to be different in different locations. Second reason is that there are always multiple reactions that's happening. So there is always a competition for reactants, and when the diffusion and the reaction, nonlinear reaction happens simultaneously, this competition leads to local hotspots that may be formed. Now the way to control is we should really worry about it only when the hotspots are present near the wall of the reactor, and if the temperature is known to increase higher than the melting point of the catalyst. If that doesn't happen, then we should not worry about it. So if it is along the wall, then we have to make sure that the construction of the reactor is strong enough to withstand the temperature. There are uncertainties associated with it because there is no way as of today to measure what's happening inside. There's no way. There's no clean way to do it in a reactor scale, in an industrial scale reactor, what's happening inside the reactor. All we can do is we can measure things at the surface, we can measure the concentration outside, and try to infer what's happening inside. So if we know how to do it, if we know that the hotspots are formed, then we try to write models and try to make a prediction as to where the hotspots is. So the decision as to how to control it will strongly depend upon what the location is.
Nowadays we are talking about the microreactors. Okay, suppose I have to make a 1 liter of product, and I have the microreactor of 10 microliter each capacity. Then I require the 1 lakh reactor. Okay. Now for the given system, for the given reaction, the conventional system is available. Okay. Then why we are going to the microreactor system?
Efficiency is always an issue.
Now, if the reaction is, let's say, 20%, and if I have 5 liter reactor, and if the reaction gives me 20% conversion, okay, then I can separate that 20% conversion, 20% product. Okay, then definitely it will cheap than by using the 1 lakh reactor.
Yeah, that's a design question, and it's very specific to a given reaction you're looking at. One can actually work out the numbers and figure out which is better.
Actually, my question is, using the microreactor is aimed to minimize the cost, or it is applied to the specialized reactions that are not carried out in the.
You see, finally, when it comes to manufacturing anything, the manager sitting in a company is always worried about economics. So whichever is economical, he's going to go for that. It doesn't matter what reaction it is.